Okay, now we're talking. So we are starting our conversation today about how to kick VMware to the curb. That's maybe a little bit of a spicy title for the session. What we're really talking about is how you consider the idea of leaving or moving or exiting your on-premise data center, or maybe augmenting your on-premise data center where you're trying to scale it back. We're going to talk a little bit about how companies are accomplishing this, how thinking about the picture, and then what you need to think about as you start to examine your cloud data center ecosystem. So with me today, first I'll just introduce myself. I'm Nathan Lasnoski. I'm Concurrency's Chief Technology Officer. I lead many organizations in helping design their cloud journey, how they look at the ecosystem they're running today, and how they orient themselves toward a future that is allowing them to build on the cloud ecosystem of that's available to them. And I'll be helping lead this conversation. But with me is Ayman. Ayman, why don't you just introduce yourself a little bit?
Hey everyone, Ayman Mageed. I am coming into Concurrency as the new cloud practice leader, bringing in about 15, 16 years of cloud and networking background, and really looking forward to coming in with Nathan here and demystifying Azure to the masses.
Awesome. Thanks, Ayman. Okay, so we're going to start this with just talking about a little bit of a self-identification of where each of us might be at. And associated with this self-identification, I think one of the better tools to use to think about that is a cloud maturity curve. And this is one that I've been using for probably, oh man, almost 6, 7, 8 years now in terms of how to think about where you are on a journey. And you still may be anywhere on this cycle, but I think it's a great way for us to orient where you are today. So lower left-hand corner, which you can see, is identification of an organization that is still primarily on-premise. And oddly enough, I still run into a lot of organizations that are completely there. They're using on-premise collaboration communication tools, mostly on-premise data infrastructure. Maybe their core application is running mostly on-premise, and it's leveraging sort of historical technologies. Perhaps it's even iSeries, kind of like bone anchor technologies, but also might be something just more akin to like Windows virtual machines that are running the predominant business applications that exist in the ecosystem. So many organizations still sort of sit at this legacy on-premise space. And usually when an organization is there, there's other parts of the organization that are starting to go around IT. And it's have been going around IT perhaps for a long time, lighting up SaaS applications, starting to build their applications in the cloud, and exists in this sort of stagnant IT, but scattered cloud that's gotten bursted up within the business to be able to enable that new innovation. What I'm finding is that as organizations look to jump from one of these two spots, the number one spot or the number two spot, they're thinking about what that future looks like for them and understanding that there's a skills gap, there's an opportunity for them to take advantage of cloud computing, but the people may not be quite ready for it. The skills may not be quite ready for it. And they're not sure how to work with the economics as part of that picture. So what we're going to be talking about today is what do you need to think about and why? So why and what do you need to think about as you start to picture the movement up into these higher levels of maturity? And one of the core elements that we'll discuss today is what does it mean to operationalize different cloud estate positions? So as you look toward, maybe I could leave that colo and go to Azure. Maybe I can not renew my on-premise data center racks and move those into Azure. Maybe I can not renew some of that VMware contract and move that into Azure. What does that appropriate operationalized cloud environment look like? And how might I consider that picture? And then in conjunction with that, how do I think about what builds on top of it? From building streamlined cloud product development and starting to leverage capabilities that are already being asked for by the business. Artificial intelligence, data estate, building a modern application. All of these build on the skills that you're establishing as part of an operationalized cloud, as well as other elements that you might modernize along the way. So we'll talk about some of those parts of the picture and help you to think about how you might consider this in your own organization. One thing I'm going to call out here as we start to talk about this is we're going to assertively use the chat as part of a Q&A session. So as we go along here, I want you to make sure you're putting your questions in the chat. We will be answering those as we go along. So I'll either answer them out loud or Ayman will answer them out loud, or we'll answer them in the chat as we go. So drop those questions or comments that you have out there, and we'd be happy to address them as we go. Okay, so as you think about this idea of, wow, like, could I leave this on-premise data center, or could I enable my new workloads to go into a cloud estate? I want you to think about 3 different operational states that you might be living in at any given point. The first is Horizon 1. And Horizon 1, just kind of think about is, this is what is right in front of me. This is what I'm doing right now. This is how I have to operate the environment that I currently have, that it's just keeping the lights on kind of activities. And operating an on-premise estate, you have monitoring tools, backup tools, skills. And in most on-premise estates, you're operating the SAN and the networking and the storage and the VMware and the deployment in that environment and the ITSM tools that circle around it and the monitoring and backup and recovery. All of that is part of operating that legacy data center operations estate. And when you start to look at the opportunity to move these into the cloud, realize you're moving to a different horizon of operational excellence. So when you move to Horizon 2, Horizon 2 is really defined as, I have a virtual machine, just like I had in my on-premise environment, but that virtual machine is operating in a modern operational state. So that means that I'm using cloud-centric monitoring tools, cloud-centric recovery tools, cloud-centric DR tools. My deployment ecosystem might be using infrastructure as code. I might be microsegmenting the workloads using a different kind of model that I used on premise. So it represents a skill jump as well as an operational change from your on-premise environment, but also represents a way for your team to modernize their skill sets to be able to work in the Horizon 3 ecosystem. So the Horizon 3 ecosystem meaning cloud native deployment, cloud SaaS-oriented deployment of data estates, or something like an AVD or W365 we'll talk about later. The Horizon 3 state represents this refactoring of the workload. And in some cases, you can jump right from 1 to 3. In other cases, it makes a lot of sense just to move to Horizon 2 in order to move to Horizon 3. So we'll talk about each of these, but realize that each represents an operational state that is different from the one that you're operating in Horizon 1.
I think this is one of those situations where us as an organization, in many organizations, have moved to Horizon 2, and we were very excited because back in the day we made the move into cloud. But then if you stop there, there's almost this law of diminishing returns, right? Where yes, we can take advantage of some of the cloud aspects, but we're not really getting into Azure functions, serverless opportunities. We're not managing containers. And so that cost savings that we were looking for doesn't materialize because we've taken some of our problems right into Azure with us and we haven't solved for them, right? So if we, this relates to, this Broadcom move, right? And VMware is like, if we're bringing this in, do we have a plan, or are we just taking kind of the old into the new and just maintaining it at a potentially higher price as well?
Yeah, great point. Great point. So I think a good place to start in terms of how people are thinking about those migrations is not just the why, but also what has caused them to consider moving out of their on-premise ecosystem. What are the what spurs that on? What causes that initial perspective? I think the one we see the most is when companies are going through an M&A. So when companies are going through a mergers and acquisitions activity, there's 2 situations that could be happening. One is a company might be intaking a company that they just bought into their new organization, or they might be spinning off a business into its own independent business. They might be taking something they already are and splitting it in 2. In those projects, companies rarely decide to keep their current data center operations. And there's 2 reasons why. The first reason is because if it's an intake, that existing data center represents a high degree of risk. You probably already know organizations that have been compromised as a result of ransomware or security estate problems. And organizations that are intaking another organization into their estate rarely want to take on that risk, and they very rarely just want to lift them into an on-premise data center. Typically, we're finding that we're taking that established environment and we're migrating that into a modernized Horizon 2 data center in the cloud. A, to mitigate the security risks, because there's a variety of things we can do as we make that migration, and B, because it allows them to sort of clean up the operational ecosystem along with it. So that's sort of one reason. The second reason is because it establishes an operational state that's moving their staff toward a modern set of skills. And that's also one of the reasons why PE firms tend to like this, especially when you're spinning them out, is they also don't want to be left with like the tech debt associated with that on-premise environment. They want to bring that into a modern environment that they can hire with modern skills. So very rarely do we find that companies want to stick around with that on-premise ecosystem. They tend to want to mitigate the standing risk by moving it into an environment that they can better support. The second sort of related ecosystem that kind of spurs this on is I've got a tier 2 data center. My contract is near renewal or approaching renewal, and I want to look at a higher maturity vehicle to be able to operate my legacy workloads. And I've heard, some CIOs say like there's no reason to move legacy workloads to the cloud. I just 100% disagree with that. Main reason being skill development. Second reason being establishing an ecosystem that those workloads can live in that cleans up a lot of the tier 1, tier 2 mistakes that companies have had as they've been operating those workloads. And the third reason from my perspective is looking for cost savings. Like I can generally find increased cost savings over a tier 2 data center by moving it to Azure and then establishing reserved instances along with it. So something to think about there. The third scenario is just simply on-premise cost replacement. If you have an existing data center and you're starting to need to replace pieces of that, I need to buy a new data domain, or I need to add storage to my SAN, or I need to like all those elements, that is bad money. Like you're adding bad money rather than good money because I can't reduce that later. I bought another hardware boat anchor that I've got to hang on to for X period of time and depreciate. How do I get out of that cycle? That is where I'm seeing many companies make that choice. The fourth scenario that's causing people to make that choice is they're actively moving to SaaS and PaaS models anyway. So like great example we'll talk about in a second is like if you have a big RDS or Citrix farm, you're probably already looking at moving to Azure Virtual Desktop or W365. Like it just, even if I was moving it to the cloud, I wouldn't lift those RDS servers. I would be moving to one of those two models. And you're probably already in the process of doing that. Or you might be building new applications that are ground up container-based apps, which you're just simply not going to be doing in your on-premise environment for the most part. And that kind of goes to this point, which is the high percentage of new things are already landing in the cloud. The number of companies, for example, that are putting their data state in an on-premise ecosystem is like nothing. It's mostly either a cloud Snowflake, Azure estate, or it's going toward Fabric as a SaaS-based estate that's being built in the cloud. None of which renews the on-premise data center as an option. Ayman, any perspective on these?
No, I think we're going to hit on a topic here in the next slide, but really what it comes down to is um, are we making decisions because someone just notified us and told us we need to be out of this by X date, or are we actually taking into account the future growth and strategy of whether it be a cloud strategy or the enterprise strategy? So when we think of cloud as a commodity, we run into these situations where we do a quick business case, we move into cloud, and then we are asking the question a couple months down the road why we're not saving money. But when we start looking at these migration options that we're about to pivot to, it really makes sense. Like I would not clean my garage out and keep the things that I should probably throw out or modernize,
Yeah.
right? And then put them back in because then I've just continued to waste that space and now I'm paying for it figuratively. Luckily, I'm not paying for my garage anymore. But that is the premise here is like when we are moving into cloud, we're also shifting into that new mindset of how do I get rid of legacy data center operations that we've all held onto because majority of us have grown up in that space and leveraging some of those kind of accelerators.
I love that example of a garage. I recently had the most freeing experience. I got two dumpsters and I parked them outside of my house and I filled them up with junk that I've been carrying from house to house with me. And it was the most freeing experience to just chuck stuff. And I was having this conversation with my wife and she was like, oh, you're gonna need like a week to like figure out what you're gonna throw out and like organize all that. I'm like, I need a day. I
Yep.
need a day. I know I have no problem filling two dumpsters with junk from my basement and just, things in your garage and old wood that you have been hanging on to and old bikes that you don't want to repair. It's just junk. And this is one of those freeing moments of my misspelled decommission to really hit on this idea that one of the best things you can do at this point is to identify what you're not moving. That there's workloads that you can straight up shut down. And that's a very freeing experience of exiting the data center is having a honest conversation about what you don't need to move. When we're doing many of these mergers and acquisitions projects, one of the things that comes into play is a list of applications. And let's say there's 300 applications with 500 servers tied to it. And that's the like starting list. And what happens very quickly as you get into that conversation is you discover, well, a third of them are utility servers that we need to operate the on-premise data center. And then another 20% are RDS and VDI systems. And another good 10% of that is just stuff we can just shut off because nobody uses anymore or it's not valuable to the organization. You chop down
Correct.
that estate to this much more small subset just by decommissioning.
I'm looking
And
at
then
a list of
yeah,
applications right now, and some of those naming conventions even of the servers themselves say deprecated, decommissioned, but it's still there, right? So it's literally another chance to do that cleanup of, yeah, I'm pretty sure that server is not supposed to be there. We can, have that conversation and not even put the effort into migrating.
100%. And then the flip side is this picture of migrating to SaaS. Like you may be already really close to not even migrating that workload to begin with. It's tied in with the decommission, right? You lit up a SaaS platform. Maybe you've been an example of this. Like I was talking to a company, they had this like SharePoint 2000, 2010 or something, SharePoint environment. That's like an on-premise SharePoint environment, and they're on
Yeah.
Office 365. It's like, why do you still have that? It's not patched, not updated. It's like, oh, we just had some old stuff out there we're trying to keep around. Like, archive that thing, man. Shut it off,
At
throw it in
pennies.
archive storage, get
Yep.
rid of it. Um, so then this leaves us with like the three middle options. Okay. So it leaves us with these. And this is maybe where I'll diverge a little bit from where some messaging you might get. I would urge you to migrate, if you're moving to the cloud, to think about these two options: migrating to native Azure virtual machines and modernizing workloads along the way. I find that when companies move to AVS, they are not really achieving Horizon 2. They are like they're sort of tempted by that idea. I can maintain my current skill set and exit my data center. But the problem with that is you now have a cloud data center operating the old skill set that isn't helping your team to move along the path. And just as quickly, you can move to native Azure virtual machines and get the skill modernization along the way as part of that migration. So I would really suggest that you pick one or two, which is modernize the workload along the way. And we'll talk about that in a second.
The other piece to it is, as much as AVS sounds very alluring, there's a different service solution that you have to spin up to create that Azure VMware service, and it requires some very unique networking. So if you are operating at scale or are looking to scale up, whether it's through acquisition or just natural growth of the organization, you're going to need to really architect that networking to make sure that you don't have these disconnects between other dependencies. The other piece of it is if you're maintaining a hybrid environment, remember that you're paying for every time that you're either backing up outside of Azure or having those egress costs. So AVS creates a little bit more of a unique kind of snowflake Whereas if you're trying to continue to scale up, it's much easier to set a landing zone that we're going to talk about here shortly, and talk about landing zone and be able to scale that and add and subtract at a moment's notice, especially when we get into the DevOps piece of infrastructure as code and just being able to tear something down, build it right back from new instead of kind of creating that unique environment essentially that we have to tiptoe around.
100%. Okay. So let's move over to a little bit more detailed version of that Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3 ecosystem. So if you think about this as H1, H2, H3, okay? So each of these represent a service component that is going to move from one domain to another. And I'm not going to like talk about every single one of these, but as you stare at the slide, you can start to see the modernization of those different ecosystems. So I'll give you a kind of quick example here would be like, let's say you have a on-premise RDS, Citrix, or Horizon sort of VM environment for your personal virtual machines. I would not lift and shift your RDS servers into Azure. It is as fast to migrate those RDS clusters into Azure Virtual Desktop and or combination with Windows 365 because Azure Virtual Desktop essentially is RDS with additional features like being able to run Teams inside of the AVS instance. And you don't have to administer the infrastructure that sits underneath it. So projects run that need to run really fast, like mergers and acquisitions that have an exit date with a TSA end date, we still are moving straight to AVS rather than lifting the RDS clusters. On the other hand, if you are operating a Windows server running on VMware, you're probably like a non-RDS server, for example, you're probably still moving that as is, but you're changing it to a Windows Azure VM running on Azure with the future opportunity of moving to container-based applications or functions as part of a refactor. Same kind of idea with SQL, right? Like if you're running a Windows SQL server, you could lift that Windows SQL server, or you might consider flipping it over to like a managed instance or something along those lines. It's sometimes people overestimate the opportunity to refactor the SQL side of the picture over things like Azure SQL as part of the initial move. But that's a near-term opportunity at Horizon 3 to say, I still got all these Windows SQL servers. Can I pivot these over to Azure SQL as part of the picture? So understand that like some of these shifts can happen really fast and some of these shifts cannot. The other part of this picture that I just want you to consider, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later, is as you perform this move, there's a whole variety of tools like backup, patching, monitoring that are going to move to modern tools that are adjacent. Don't feel tempted. We will be tempted, but avoid the temptation to drag your management estate with you to the cloud. Look at that anew so you can leverage tools that A, come with the platform, B, can be orchestrated through infrastructure as code, and leverage that modern skill set that lets you work at the Horizon 3 level. Leverage an Azure backup or a modern kind of duplicate of that. Azure Update Management, Azure Monitor. Get yourself using those native tools as part of that move. And then you ultimately decommission huge parts of your on-premise estate that you're not going to be running anymore. So lots of opportunity here to think about how it moves from point A to point B.
I guess, Nathan, I have a question. I am overwhelmed by the fact that I have to do all this, right? Do I need to go into this Horizon 3 refactored environment from scratch, or what if my team's not upskilled to the point where we can potentially handle that? I know there's options, but could I potentially stay in the Horizon 2 period for, X amount of time until we can get to that level? How does that work? Or how have you seen that work?
I mean, Horizon 2 is the typical landing zone for mergers and acquisitions project or someone trying to lead the data center. I mean, the Horizon 3 is that incremental move that happens post the Horizon 2 migration, typically. And I'm curious about your perspective. Like, one of the things that I found is that the biggest question mark, and we hit this later on like cost, is when do I apply reserved instances and when don't I? Like, let's say that I've
Ah,
moved
yes.
my SQL servers and my Windows servers. I know that if I do reserved instances, I gain tons of cost benefit. But I also don't want to over reserve instance myself if I'm going to be scaling it back. So
There-
I think there's a lift, drive efficiencies, and then
That's right.
apply the
There's
reserved
there's
instance. Is
I
that
mean, this
similar to what you've
probably could
been?
be a whole nother topic, but I think the idea would be you have this Band-Aid fix, immediate moment where you reduce what you can, decommission, we talked about, and then with the remaining portion, you have to commit to some sort of level of RIs because you want to reduce the pricing. There is actually a break-even calculator that allows you to even if you picked a 3 year reserved instance, there's a point in that 3 years where you've made your money back. And it's not always the 3 year mark, right? So it's often what I found is anywhere between the 14 to 16 months. So in times for certain workloads or certain SKUs, it makes sense to pay for the 3 year, but you have to make this calculation, obviously. Pay for the 3 year because you know that I for sure will have it for the 16 months break even or whatever the break even portion is. The other piece is where are we applying reserved instances? If we can standardize on a set of SKUs that majority of our engineers are going to use these types of virtual machines, then we can standardize that at the management group level rather than at specific subscriptions. And then as you add subtract that SKU, it doesn't really make that much of a difference in the grand scheme of things because there's always that capacity to manage. And so you definitely need to have some sort of quarterly FinOps type plan at a minimum. I would say maybe quarterly. Ideally, it's a weekly thing. That's what we were used to do, and then you're looking for anomalies that you can catch. And then there's times where you say, okay, this is our operational plan, but then we have a QX date where we're going to reduce a certain footprint. And this kind of opens us up again to when we think of cloud as an enterprise solution and not just one technology, is how are we integrating with things like our portfolio management, right? And tiering of our applications, because that can help us decide what goes into the refactored environment section. Are we going for a tier one application and going like kind of risk it for the biscuit type situation, or are we going to start with some of our tier three, tier four applications because we have a little bit of room to learn there and get some lessons learned, and then move into those more unique or critical cash cow type applications. So this is probably something that I'd love to kind of re-explore with everybody here because that's definitely another factor that we need to consider.
100%. 100%. Okay, so with all this understood, I want to go through some recommendations that we have associated with as you start to plan this estate. And there was a question that came up about, all right, cool. Like, I want to consider what it looks like to exist in the cloud as a next step. Um, I think that's a variety of different elements we're going to talk about. One is, what does the org look like? What do the skills look like? What does the platform look like that I'm establishing? But then the big question everybody probably has is, how do I like factor and understand the cost of that? So recommendation like 4 or something, it's like a top, when you see one of those like clickbait things and it says number 4 is the best. That one is that topic is going to be in our recommendation set. So a couple topics coming, but I think that is going to be one that really addresses that question, sir. So we'll get to that. We're going to start it though by talking about like, as you consider this move, you're also planning for the future. Like, even if you said, I'm maintaining my old data center, some people have said, like, I'm just leaving the old data center here and everything new goes to the cloud as a refactored state. What does that organization look like? And how do I prepare for even new workloads going there as I drain the old one? I think this is one of the more critical steps because it's about transforming your people, not just about the cost. And we'll hit the cost thing in a second. So the first thing I think you need to consider as you're going down this path, and I'm going to move through a few of these slides relatively fast, is your operational model. And this is very much tied to how big you are, like how big, how complicated, and what is the operational model of the business itself. Most organizations are going to fall into this category, which is this idea that you establish a cloud center of excellence that facilitates centralized control ecosystems where IT is mainly the administrator of the app and the infrastructure, in scenarios where it's not, where like where IT is like the infrastructure admin or is maybe even just the governor, but then an area of the business is totally accountable for that app. You're establishing an operational model that facilitates you owning and managing that ecosystem. And then on the other sides of this, you see things like decentralized operations, which is like startup territory, and the distributed operations where the company is almost like a holding company, and you have business one, but then you have like other businesses that operate as their own satellites that have their own distributed ecosystems. Most companies sort of fall into this spot right here. So I'm not going to drain this. I think it's important to understand that you will have responsibilities in IT that need to be established in order to move to a cloud estate. So if you're like, I want to be out of the VMware estate on-premise tomorrow, these are the three elements you're going to need to have in place in order to be successful. First, you need to have a part of your organization that understands what governance looks like for the cloud. And that means you're establishing the policies and controls associated with that ecosystem. You're building a project support capability that's in main extent probably supporting your move, like probably supporting the actual migration of the workloads from the on-premise environment to the modern environment. And then there's an enablement function. And organizations that aren't even moving from their existing estate and they're just focusing on the new estate are mainly doing 1 and 3, with 2 being the migration support. 1 is governance, 3 is enablement. They're always a balancing. You can't govern something that there isn't a purpose for. So you're not going to just govern. You need to enable too. But you also can't enable without governance. You need both. And the enablement function is building that FinOps capability and combining that with onboarding new workloads in a responsible and appropriate way, and helping those assets to get established in a pattern that you can actively support. And FinOps is probably one of the most important components of what you need to get skills around as you move out. Because you were talking about that, Ayman, like the extent to which you have your hands on the dials of reserved instances, licensing benefits, optimization is real. Like the difference between great, good, and not good is many, many, many millions of dollars in larger estates. So something to get, very, very good at is that.
This is my pet project topic, so I will refrain from taking us down that
Thank you.
aisle, but it's definitely it is a beauty when you can get down to forecasting cloud costs plus or minus 5 to 8% versus plus or minus 15 to 30%, because finance starts to love you too. And
100%.
when you're friends with finance, then things get easier. I don't know why.
Okay, I'm gonna put this up on the screen. You can screenshot it. You can also get the deck from us later, but this is sort of a skilling path. So as you are thinking about the skills that your team needs to start to gain as they are moving into operating in the Azure environment as opposed to an on-premise environment, I would suggest that you not just expect them to get training, but expect them to get certifications. And I know sometimes we think like certifications, they're not necessary, they're not representative of real life. I think that's starting to change. I think that they are representative of at least the base skills that are helpful for a person to understand as they're operating these environments. So as you look at the different lanes, start to think about how you can move your people up those paths. So in conjunction with this, or recommendation 2 is, in addition to having the corporate governance, you also need to establish the management framework that's going to exist. So a lot of organizations, as they start going into their new ecosystem, they have like a subscription that was established and they start to consolidate everything underneath a few subscriptions. And they find very frequently that doesn't build them a manageable cloud ecosystem that lets them take advantage of some of the scalable structures of the cloud, but also runs into subscription boundaries. So we recommend you not go toward models where you're heavily consolidating under subscriptions. And also don't go towards strategies where you have so many subscriptions, but no structure around them. Build toward a structure that's called the cloud adoption framework. It's very well documented at this point. We're living in an age where many of the best practices have been pretty well laid out. And what you can notice here is that the separations of concerns that exist. And this starts to get to another fundamental why behind moving to cloud ecosystems. It's the opportunity to address separations of concerns associated with parts of the ecosystem. Walling off identity in your domain controllers, walling off your management ecosystem components like your tooling, walling off the connectivity to the on-premise environment, having a discrete sandbox that has no connectivity to the on-premise environment or the operational environment, and then building what's called landing zones, which is this idea of a vertical stack of applications, each of these being subscriptions that new workloads move into or workloads move into. And what this is really facilitating is a scale environment that is siloed from each other that allows you to be able to mitigate not just the cost questions, but also mitigate some of the exposure that you had on premise, especially things like ransomware and other exposure items. So that's going to come into play quite a bit. We could talk for probably an hour just on CAF alone, but understand that there is a best practice in terms of how to establish this. And this becomes, that box essentially becomes the center of gravity around all these other boxes that circle around it and represent the other pieces that sort of them as a data workload lands or an app workload lands, or you're doing something in Fabric. All of this sort of attaches to that greater picture. So you'll also find that you start to establish patterns as you're migrating into the environment. This may be a lift and shift scenario, or it might be a internal or external facing app. And you're going to make some decisions around what is the pattern that I'm adopting. So it might be like I'm using private endpoints, I'm using public endpoints, and all this fits into different types of scenarios. So you'll be establishing some patterns in the way as part of your governance estate. So maybe for an internal facing app, external facing app, or of kind of representative other alternative associated with that. So this leads us into a conversation of, as I'm moving out of my VMware environment into the cloud, how do I change my deployment practices? And this represents one of the more important shifts that you're going to see from a skills development standpoint, and why I don't recommend AVS in comparison to deploying virtual machines. And that's primarily because we're attempting to lay down an ecosystem that's maintainable later. And we want an operational model that doesn't leave the sort of haves and have-nots of the sort of manageable ecosystem. And the first thing to understand is that as you move into the cloud, some of the decisions you make in your provisioning process are going to affect downstream on the FinOps side. So you're establishing this understanding of at least the name and its relationship to the workloads that sit underneath it. And this may have a relationship also to your ITSM system over time. And as you're doing that provisioning, you're getting the opportunity to be able to capture all these different data. So as I inventory a workload from on-premise, I relate that to the servers that I have. I'm capturing each of these elements, and these elements get captured within the context of tags and classifications and documentation that I then use to apply policies to the migrated workloads, such as like what kind of encryption do I need, or how am I applying cost, or are there certain elements of the infrastructure missing if it's a highly available application. So these are captured along the way that then allows you to support a service provisioning workflow, not just for the new workloads, but for everything you've moved as well. And this is this point for a second. In your on-premise environment, if you had to redeploy one of your workloads, even the virtual machines, pretty frequently we can't do that. When we move it into the cloud, one of the things we do along with it is build a service provisioning workload for even the old workloads, So like as you migrate that virtual machine, you should be able to redeploy that VM and then restore a backup to it based upon a saved configuration you have that is redeployable. And that isn't that it's relatively trivial to do because it's already infrastructure as code in the cloud. So we can just take advantage of that as a deployment ecosystem.
Yeah, one of the coolest things as I was learning cloud actually was going through the motions of creating something on the console and realizing that I can actually pull the backend ARM template that was used to create it. So it was a learning as I like on the job learning essentially, because I was able to go through it and say, oh, this is exactly what configurations or parameters it used and how it went through it. I don't want to discredit, or not discredit, but just kind of gloss over this piece and the importance that it brings. When we talk about service provisioning, this opens up again the world of how do I bring other enterprise systems into play with what I'm doing in the cloud. I worked with a few clients where they were looking for a service catalog for the developers. We're talking about innovation and speed to market here. When everybody's a technology company, even Goodyear Tires is a technology company because even though they're making tires and on a manufacturing line, they have an application, they have web apps, etc. And so those developers, well, it wasn't Goodyear, but that client was able to provide this front end, call it vending machine, for their developers, and they're able to create ephemeral, point in time virtual machines that they could use for testing, for development, for hosting their applications. And it was available to them because of the infrastructure as code that was set up and the ability to, like going back to the tagging, being able to understand who owns it, what is that total cost of ownership for each application and or department, however we want to set up the organization, gives us that more holistic picture of, as a CIO, can I tell my organization, I know where every dollar is spent. There might be some shared services costs. We can talk about that on the side, but most of my dollars are spent on the cloud. I can attribute to a cost center, a department, or an application. I can also attribute it to production, development, or test or QA. So having that flexibility and setting those guardrails, as I mentioned in the comments section, setting those guardrails up first prevents a lot of headache at the back end. Because when we realize this midway through, half the time we usually will recommend let's just blow it up and start over because it's so much easier to start from a fresh foundational set of guardrails than to try to back our way into it. So this is an area that is like I think all of us at Concurrency are very passionate about. How do we get to that level of innovation where we're not just lifting and shifting, but making business accelerators through the cloud?
You hit a huge point on that that cost attribution point. It truly is like a delineation between highly functional and less functional organizations. The highly functional top quartile businesses are the ones that actually transfer the costs to that business area. And the ones that are less capable are the ones that kind of hold it all in IT, but just try to show it back. That ability to actually move the cost and move also the ownership of and accountability, responsibility and accountability alignment of that cost to the area of the business that truly is actually responsible for what's happening there. Big difference in terms of like actual impact. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this. One thing that we really recommend is that as you pivot to the cloud, even if you're migrating on-premise workloads, that we eschew the usage of the portal experience as a configuration plane. It should exist to see what's there, react to it, maybe have it as a playground. But as we deploy our production workloads, we have the opportunity, even if it's just like infrastructure as code, like let's say you have a virtual machine running some box product, like even that virtual machine can still be deployed as infrastructure as code via pipeline. So it allows the team that you're working with to be able to move their skills up to a higher capability level as part of lifting that workload into the cloud. Okay, so there, a couple descriptions. We hit policy and tagging a little bit. Understand that like the conversation we just had about the service provisioning process directly leads into how you manage the environment. So if you are capturing the service and that allows you to tag it, that then lets you build Azure policies that apply to those workloads that then lead to security outcomes, cost outcomes, optimization, skilling outcomes. When people try to start here because the financial manager comes to them and says, "You're spending what on Azure?" They're already, they can't fix it because they didn't start here. They didn't start at the actual service naming and tagging. It's really difficult to go fix that later. Starting with the first things first, leading to enabling us to be able to address outcomes. So there's some tagging values. We'll give you this deck later if you want to capture some of those best practices. Also some best practices there. Okay, so the big question in the beginning was like, what do I do with enterprise cost models? How do I think about this? This is this conversation. So this is a little bit of like a shot of how I like to think about this. So this is a tool that we use to think about on-premise costs and reserve costs and so on. There's two main dials that you, really three main dials that you have. The first dial is the scale back or eliminate workloads dial. Okay. So just optimization, right sizing dial. That's not tied to licensing. It's just tied to like scaling things back. And you always find that workloads can be scaled back. The second thing that you find is that you can apply hybrid use benefits, reserved instances, other kinds of sort of SaaS or PaaS based reserve assets that now exist to be able to drive that cost down. So when a lot of people look at the cost in the cloud, they take their as is cost as pay-go and they're, or even into reserves, and they're like, ooh, like that's still a lot of money. And yeah, it is, but your replacement cost I find is like, some replacement cost on premise is usually like somewhere in the here range. It's like it exists. It's more it's less expensive than pay as you go, but more expensive than reserves. It's like sits in that middle spot. I find that this is the right direction. You go from pay as you go to right sizing to reserves, and you're sort of moving down that slope, trying to get to reserves quickly, but also not reserving for things you're not keeping. And one of the things you find quickly is once you start using reserves on compute, it's the storage costs that really are the main thing. And then storage costs are a different part of the picture where I can start to eat into that by using things like archival costs that aren't represented here. So like I've got a customer that has like all sorts of expensive on-premise storage, hosting images that of different types of customer assets that go back 10 years, but they're using tier one storage for virtually everything. So moving them to the cloud to something like an Azure Files, moving the majority of that over to archival storage drastically changes even this storage picture because it starts to take them in a direction where the storage costs are really advantageous. So you got to look at it like this. You got to look at it in a picture of different dials that you're working at to try to minimize as you move into the cloud. Don't just look at like, oh, if I take this versus AVS and I dump it into AVS, I'm going to get this cost. You want to look at it in terms of how I can actually drive toward these optimizations. And then when you look at the patterns of migration, you start to group those into waves and pause periods. So this is just sort of an example of what something like that like might look like. So you take a look at those costs and you start to group applications into theoretical wave patterns. And then you understand like in those waves, what is the cost associated with different parts of it? And how have I pictured which I'm rehosting, and migrating, and then which of those, I'm actually moving to SaaS along the way. Like, and I, in a certain sense, like SaaS or modernize might be like I'm moving RDS over to an AVD instance, which is going to be less expensive than shifting the actual service itself. But you have to build out a migration plan that helps you, A, to project the costs, B, to know how I'm modernizing along the way, and C, to know like how am I managing risk and impact along this path. And you can see that in this project plan, like we've got a lot of these kind of initial servers, and then I've got SAP kind of at the tail end, A, because it's you're building skills as you go, and B, it minimizes risk. But also it's the biggest skill set chunk that has to get moved along with it. Ayman, I'll take a breath. Any thoughts?
Sorry, I'm catching up on all the comments here, but
Oh, there you go.
from what I heard, I agree with that statement. I think to also bring this all into reality, because usually all of this requires a business case, is the risk appetite, right? How are we deciding to move things that are business critical first, or are we trying to move things that are less critical? How are we um, presenting that to our counterparts in the way of saying what are the benefits and outcomes that we're going to achieve by doing this, right? I mentioned
Hmm.
here on the side application modernization lifecycle too, right? Where it's okay in the interim to have certain decisions when we're migrating, but we should have in mind an idea of I'm doing this because in X amount of years, we're going to be refactoring this application. We're going to be doing X, Y, and Z because where I've seen some organizations kind of misstep is we're going to sweat this application until it dies, and then it'll be our problem to fix it, or it'll be someone else's problem to fix it. When we have the technology and the opportunities ahead of us, I almost joke that sometimes the best place to go work is a startup because they don't have any of this tech debt, right? We're starting brand new from the cloud. I don't have to worry about my mainframes. I don't have to worry about some of this older technology, Windows 2003 servers, and I can just start working on innovation. But those are the companies that blow up and are our competitors because we are not taking care of our going back to the garage, right? We're not taking care of our garage, and so I think that's kind of where I will always bring it back to the business minded concept of sure, we have all this tech debt, but I'd rather focus on some of the tech debt that's going to support improving and improving our bottom line for the business than some of the tech debt that, like, yes, it needs to happen, but we could probably do this, kind of drag ourselves along and do this as we can as a point of opportunity.
Huge point. Huge point. So as we bounce from that into FinOps, I think we've been talking about this as we go, but FinOps really is a representation of what you did to get to this point. If you did the right pre-work in your migration, you did the right pre-work of understanding the services and grouping the applications, you're going to have an effective FinOps operation on the tail end. If you didn't do that pre-work, you're going to struggle at FinOps because you're going to see costs, you're going to see names of resources, but you're going to struggle to attribute those resources to the right targets. So understanding like what they are and what they cost and who's causing that cost to establish is one of the most critical elements of the overall ecosystem. So thinking about that in terms of billing, routing, understanding how to build a true center of excellence associated with grouping those resources is a critical part of building your migrated estate so you can hold yourself accountable to costs that you've already probably promised to your executive team as a result of your pre-planning. And that what I found is that building a FinOps team really happens in two stages. So as you are establishing that competency and you've done the right pre-work, there's two elements to maintain and build. The first is you're building a FinOps team that has a goal. And the FinOps team, when I say team, I mean this. We all know that there's opportunity that exists in our cloud environments to maintain and manage costs. I usually tell people that 20 to 40% of their cloud environment is waste. And that's people leaving things on, not using reserved instances, not scaling resources back. There's a tremendous amount of opportunity there. But we don't get it. Why? Why don't we get it? It's because we don't apply time and expertise to that problem. So it sits there and it keeps billing us. And like it's like taxes. If I actually knew how much I was writing in that check to the government every single month, I'd be a little bit more upset than the fact that it just comes out of my paycheck and I don't really look at it until I do my taxes every year. It's kind of that way with FinOps sometimes. Like we just know it's getting billed to us, but we don't put the energy in. So FinOps is really about assigning time and energy to that cost reduction and holding ourselves accountable and knowing that for every hour I apply, if I can pay off that hour double in FinOps cost reduction, I have created value for the organization. And that's moving from sort of phase one establishment to phase two reality of driving those costs down. So ultimately, the best teams, they're building and managing a backlog around those lanes on the organization that we talked about, one of which is FinOps. The other is establishing governance rules, and then those two in the middle of enablement and project support. So how that moves into where we go from here is fourfold. So how do you get started? Now, I know we're leaving this to the end, and this is like maybe one of the main topics, but it's all right, cool. This all sounds interesting. Like, I want to learn more. I want to take a next step. The first step is let's run an assessment. Let's look at what you have today. Let's use some tooling and gather it. Let's understand what the costs are in different environments. Let's look at the common refactoring options that are realistic to do quickly and understand that picture so you can cost justify. And that then lets you set the table for, all right, I do need to have enterprise governance in place. And maybe you already have some workloads in the cloud and you haven't built enterprise governance. Let's catch that up. But perhaps you haven't really put a lot out there yet. And this is why you're going to then do that governance establishment, which then lets you position new refactored workloads that you maybe didn't even migrate. You're just enabling new things like AVD or a new deployed modern estate or a data workload or an AI workload that, like, even if I had the on-premise estate, I still needed to do. But then I might then move into migrating the edge data center because I now have run the Azure assessment. I know what the actual costs are going to look like. I know what it means when I refactor them or I scale them or I apply reserved instances. And I know that this is better than me renewing my on-premise data contract, my on-premise contract, my colo contract, and I'm going to take that action. But we got to start here. Let's have that conversation. So we will do that as an investment from Concurrency. We want to have that conversation with you. We will leverage tooling to be able to help run that Azure assessment. Microsoft is oftentimes an asset to us to be able to run some of those, but we bring our own flavor to it to help you understand what that picture looks like in the future. And that's in the survey. So as you leave today, talk about how we can help you and provide some feedback as to things maybe you would have liked to see that maybe we didn't tell you, or if you love the session, we love to know that too. We always want to improve what we're doing and providing information, because part of what our goal is to lift the whole community around knowledge, but then also be an asset to you as you try to take it forward. So
100%. One piece that I just thought of actually as I was looking at this is there's a regulatory compliance piece to this as well, right? As we're making these assessments, as we're figuring out, do I need to get out of the data center? Do I need to do X, Y, and Z? How do I set up my landing zone? But there's so many blueprints that we have available to us to look at ISO 27001 or NIST and or even PCI DSS, right? Like depending on where you are in your industry, there's probably something regulatory body that is causing you obviously some headache, but some necessity. But then there's also the piece of how do I partner with security, or maybe I am the security, security kind of falls under my wing as well. And I want to reduce the threat vector that I have in my environment, right? Like if I'm on VMware, Azure, insert all these other technologies, there's so many vulnerabilities that are coming out there, and we know that the threat actors are much better and faster at finding them than we are because we have all these other operational tasks where they're just nugging away at a computer. So this is another area to consider when we're looking at running an Azure assessment is what are the functional requirements for my organization and my cloud so that we can make it fit for purpose as well.
awesome. Okay, we hope you have a great rest of the day. We're so thankful that you spent some time with us. We're looking forward to having follow-up conversations, and hopefully we'll see you on the flip side. This will be available as a recording, and then you're also able to get the deck later if it would be an asset for you. So feel free to ask for that, and we'd be happy to give you the deck as well. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.